Hello, this is Nils Grandelius for Chess24, going for game of the day from Norway Chess round 7, and I'm going to show you Vladimir Kramnik's win against world champion Magnus Carlsen. This is also my first game of the day video, so we will see how it goes. So Kramnik played e4, which he has been doing quite consistently last years. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, so far no surprises at all. Bishop c5, which Magnus regularly employs. And now seems to be the most common is to play knight d3, knight f6, short castle. The general idea is to not play this move c3 until black has committed with d6. For example, in the game he played c3, knight f6, d3, and potentially black could try to castle and play d5. And here, much like in, for example, the Marshall defense, the pawn on c3 is really annoying for white, who wants to develop his knight to c3 instead. But instead Magnus opted for d6, which is also of course very, very solid, very normal. Short castle, a6, rook e1. I mean, you could probably make a case for starting a little, let's say h3, but then you have to consider what happens if black plays h6 and g5, trying to make use of this. This potential weakness on h3. So rook e1, this is all very, very, very standard. Bishop a7, a4, short castle. Here, normally, as black, what you have to look out for is what happens after bishop g5, but here I think you're supposed to just be able to play h6, g5. And after bishop g3 you even have a choice between g4 and I think quite possible also to play some knight e7. But normally Kramnik never plays with bishop g5 in these Italian positions. He seems to believe it's not a good move, so in this game he chose h3. Probably you can play also knight bd2 or knight a3 are normal moves as well. So h3. Now it's decision time for black. There are two standard ideas. One is to go what he did with knight e7, knight g6 in order to free the c-pawn and also get rid of the knight from c6. The other, arguably even more solid option is to try to trade the bishops with, let's say, rook e8 followed by if some move like knight bd2 to play bishop e6 and trade the bishops like that. Here though, as white didn't lose time with bishop b3, it could be argued that white has a decent version after something like takes b4. Carlsen, however, went for knight e7, which, at least in my opinion, is the most ambitious option for black. Kramnik pushed d4. In a similar position, the same round, Anand played knight bd2 against Nakamura. And after knight g6, the slightly rare move bishop b3 was played. But that's a completely different story. So d4, knight g6, knight bd2. And here there are many options. One is to play h6. One is to play rook e8. And arguably the main line is what Magnus did with c6. It's also the most critical because now you really want to push d5 and kind of blow up white center. What is also interesting to note here, however, is that Magnus himself had this position with the white pieces against Karjakin in their World Championship match, and in that game Magnus opted for bishop f1. It looks quite strange, but the idea is to not be under any threat in the center. And also I think d5 is not supposed to work very well here, as you can just take here. Instead Karjakin played the slightly odd looking a5 and was soon worse after takes queen c2. And okay, something like bishop e6, knight c4, and after queen c7, b4 was quite a nice way of getting the initiative. Kramnik, however, comes up with, I think, new move bishop d3. Also very logical. Try to protect the center and hope that the vulnerability of the bishop is not really important. I think the idea, if black plays something like knight f4, you simply retreat back to f1, and now e5 is hanging, and the knight might be on f4 prematurely. I mean, e5 is now weak, and if you play something like rook e8, then just knight c4, and you might have to retreat with the knight. So kind of you're not averse to putting the bishop on f1, but you want to do it with the gain of tempo. After knight h5, quite possibly you can also go bishop f1 here, with similar ideas to create pressure on e5 later. And with the knight on h5, it's no longer possible to play d5. Carlsen went for rook e8, which I think is a very logical move. And now Kramnik played bishop c2, probably because after knight f1, I guess he was worried about something like d5. And the position might quickly turn out to be very, very dry. So bishop c2, I mean, keeping the knight on e4 in order to, after d5, be able to take with some advantage, I guess, after something like this. Takes, knight f3, rook e8, and now I think e5 is the simplest. Knight e4, just take. And take, and now the typical move for such positions, bishop g5. Should give white some advantage, I think. Here also, taking on d5 might be interesting to create some pressure after knight takes d5, bishop g5. Instead, Magnus went for h6. Kind of a slow move, allowing white to stabilize with knight f1. And here was maybe the first really key moment of the game. Black can play, I mean, Carlsen with black, he can play passively, I guess, in this position. Some move like bishop d7 and followed by queen c7, bishop e3, rook a8 or something like that. But it's somewhat boring, I think, not equalizing and also not really containing any major ideas. The main move that should be considered here, of course, is d5. But it seems that after knight takes, d takes, knight takes e4, we get something similar to before, like bishop takes e4, d takes e4, and now, for example, queen h5. And most likely the pawn on e4 is weaker than the pawn on e5. Quite a common theme in these positions. Also, I'm not sure what happens if you are just taken d8 and play bishop e3 and then try to collect the e4 pawn later. So d5 is the principal move, but it's also kind of dry, and white will be slightly ahead in some quite symmetrical position. So therefore Magnus decided to play in at least what I consider to be a very, very risky manner. He took on d4, c takes d4, and played c5. Of course, d5 is another way to play, but then after e5, knight e4, and just trade the knight with knight d2. And this kind of position is probably quite nice for white after something like takes, and the knight on g6 is a bit misplaced, h6 is a weakness. c5 is hard to achieve. So after c takes d4, c5 was definitely the idea. Now d5. But the problem here for black is that he simply has quite a passive Benoni. Normally either you have the bishop on a7 is on g7, creating like some threats along this diagonal, also especially combined with these two pawns. That's quite a good bishop. The other option for black to get counterplay normally is to create pressure against e4 and d5, especially e4. Which also here is kind of impossible to do because bishop on c2 is strong, Normally in the Benoni, the bishop would be maybe on e2 or f1. Also, now the knight can come on g3, and it's really... I mean, it's really solid, the whole white setup. So black has to look for counterplay. During the game, me and John thought knight h5 was an interesting way to create some kind of tension. Trying to jump with the knight to f4. But it seems that after a5 or something similar, it's not clear how to make progress. The point is that if the knight jumps, sorry, if the other knight jumps, then probably I can play knight e3, come with a knight to g4, and it's all quite solid for white. Not that much initiative. And after queen f6, there is again knight e3, and the knight will jump to g4 or even to f5 in some moment. So this seems to be quite a bit better for white. Doesn't seem that the activity works very well. Instead, Magnus opted for b5, which is also logical as you have the majority on the queen side. Here, we were a bit, at least I was personally a bit puzzled by Kramnik's decision to take on b5, because I thought the normal way was to play something like either knight g3 and create some extra stability. After bishop d7, you can, for example, play bishop e3 and queen d2. Or also, if you want to play b3 and to get the bishop on this diagonal. I think also b3 is one very valid option immediately as well. In order to put the bishop on b2. What I like about this is that if black one day plays c4, I can often just play b4 and a5. And the queen side is shut down. And with the queen side shut down, it's free rolling for white on the king side, where he has more space and more pieces. So this long term is very, very dodgy for black. Instead, Kramnik went for this kind of more, I would probably call it the more concrete option. Trying to make use of the pin on the a file, and also maybe to create some tension, some pressure against the c5 pawn. Knight g3, bishop d7, and here again, both me and Jan thought that b3 was... b3 was the correct idea in order for, let's say, after bishop b6 to take and play bishop b2. And the bishop is incredibly strong on this diagonal, and taking on f6 is a big threat. We were discussing maybe that black needs to play some knight e5 kind of moves and to go for this structure. Here it's not that easy for white to break through, but on the other hand it's also very passive for black. Basically what you're hoping for is to get some small counterplay on the queen side, but it's really not that much. Instead, Kramnik went for normal looking developing move, bishop b3, bishop e3. But here I think he's kind of letting Carlsen off the hook slightly. Bishop b6 was played, very logical. Now takes, b4 was what to be expected. Queen a7. It was also actually possible to play, let's say, something like queen b8, b takes c5, and now maybe even d takes c5. And while it looks like white has a very nice center and will start to push, it's not that easy, because e5 is hard to achieve, because your pawn on f2 cannot move to f4 very easily. And it's also, the bishop now would be much better on b2, but it's a long way there. And if black is given time, of course he will start to push, maybe c4, maybe b4, maybe both. Create some very serious counter chances. So queen a7 is probably played with a similar idea, but then after queen a1, I mean, still black should be okay. We were thinking that rook a8 is the most logical, takes, rook takes, and okay, white is probably slightly better, but it's not that much. And black definitely has some counterplay. Here also, a move like rook c8 looks quite strong. creating the tactical threat of taking on b4, perhaps. Which is not that easy to parry, because the bishop simply doesn't have too many good squares. Also, you can later fight for the a file if you want to. So generally, I think this whole maneuver, I mean this whole phase of the game went in black's direction, and really, I think the key point is that the bishop belongs on to b2, on the long diagonal, not on e3. But okay, he had his idea to put pressure on c5, he played queen a1, increasing, in some sense, the pressure, queen c7. And now? Yeah, queen c7, yeah. Now something very interesting happened in the game. Because here, of course, white can continue in a similar fashion and play a move like rook c1, keeping tension, creating some pressure on the c file. And not that clear what black is up to. Maybe he should take on b4? No. Bishop b3, let's say, and yeah, it's not that clear what is going on. But of course, what really like strikes the eye immediately after queen c7 is that white has this possibility of taking on h6. Very sharp move. Of course, you cannot take back because queen takes f6 and knight h5, and it's just mate. Interestingly enough, this bishop takes h6, which is really first move that comes to mind, was said to be missed by Carlsen in the press conference, which is very surprising because, okay, it's the first move that comes to mind. But c takes b4, only move, creating counter threat against c2, and also more importantly, or equally importantly, prepares queen c3. Bishop takes g7. Here still it was possible to bail out with some rook c1, maybe queen c3. I mean, maybe white is slightly better here, but it's probably rather unclear. So bishop takes g7 is by far the critical move. Again, you cannot take because the knight is pinned. Next move white takes with easy win. So queen takes c2. Queen takes f6. Here it was possible to play rook e2. If the queen goes back, f6 is hanging, so black has to take. Knight takes, king takes g7, and we have a very messy position with the queen and 3 pawns against, no, actually queen and 1 pawn against rook and 2 bishops. But the king is still weak, and after something like knight g3, I think it's quite messy. Knight h5 is a threat, knight e5 looks like the only move. Takes, let's say d takes. And now maybe queen c1 or even queen b2. I mean, it's all... Black should be fine, but maybe he's not better. It's just basically a mess. But queen takes f6, of course, is the critical move. And here, a very critical moment in the game. We thought that bishop takes f2 was actually the only move. And the lines are quite complicated. The point, of course, for white is that you cannot take the rook, because then bishop h6, bishop c3, e5, and it's not possible to protect against the mate on g7 after bishop takes, knight takes. So you have to play queen c3, because also the threat, of course, bishop h6. So queen c3, and here e5 doesn't work. Looks like the most tempting option, but knight takes e5. And now bishop h6 is not possible because knight g4. Discovered check. So after knight takes e5, you can take with the rook, but then just rook takes e5, and after bishop h6, you can, for example, take here and just take on d5. And the queen is protected, and also the queen protects g7. So e5 doesn't work here. Rook therefore white has to move the rook. The rook is hanging, and rook e2 takes. I mean, you can also start here and then play a move like, I don't know, bishop c5 for example, and knight h5, white has some initiative, some possibilities with knight f6 after moving the bishop. But on the other hand, let's say, I don't know, rook a8, bishop g5, some king f8, for example. I mean, white has a very nice structure. He has a nice square on f6. But on the other hand, the b pawn might turn out to be very, very strong. So I wouldn't say that the position is very clear at all. But also black has this possibility: bishop takes g3. The king takes g3. There is the ultra strong computer move bishop f5. Very nice. I mean, the idea is of course that it's pinned. If you take on f5 with the pawn, the rook takes on e2, and that's it. And if you take on f5 with the queen, then of course you can take on g7 back, and black is probably even better here. So white should take on c3, b takes c3, bishop takes c3, and now rook takes e4. And 3 pawns each. Maybe white can claim to be a tiny bit better due to the black king, but most likely it's just draw. So bishop f2, bishop takes f2 actually held, and it would kind of defend his decision to play this queen c7 earlier to allow all these tactics. But instead, Magnus probably miscalculated and took with the queen on f2. I'm not quite sure what he missed, but after king h8, king h2, it turns out to be very difficult to stop the mate. He had two options. He played bishop d8, but knight e5 was the other move. Then after knight takes e5, queen takes f6, bishop takes f6, d takes e5, knight h5. White will move the bishop and bishop to g5, and knight will come to f6. Most likely white is a bit, I mean, clearly better. Not clear if it's winning, but he's for sure pressing a lot. So bishop d8 was the choice. Now if you go back, for example, queen a1 to protect the bishop, then knight h4 is very strong. Takes, and it's a pin. And if the knight moves, then I simply take the rook on e1. But of course, Kramnik was intending to take on d6, counter-threaten the bishop on d7. And the position is still very sharp. We thought during the game that bishop takes h3 was the critical move. After king takes h3, you can play king takes g7. And I mean, it looks very dangerous for both kings. White is currently not even material up, but he will get a very strong knight on f5, and he will have some initiative. Whereas black simply doesn't seem to be quite in time to create any threats. Rook e2, let's say. Now rook h8 is sadly for black nothing, because king g4, and the king is completely safe on g4. So you have to go back, and then, for example, knight f5, king h8, and simply g3, and black is really suffering because the d pawn is very strong and the knight is very strong, and yeah, there isn't much good to be said about the black position. But still, bishop takes h3 was by far the best chance to complicate matters in time trouble, because Magnus finally played knight h4, being quite low on time, but the problem is that after simply knight takes h4, bishop takes h4, knight h5, he had, I mean, it looks like if the bishop moves, then queen h6, and it will be mate on h8. But he had a final desperado trick up his sleeve. He took on h3. Now if you take, it doesn't work anymore, because you can take on e1, and after queen h6, you have queen h1 check, king g4, queen takes g2, and something like this, and white will just be mated. So this was his main trick, to sacrifice the bishop, some desperado sacrifice. But Kramnik calmly played rook g1, and keeping the threat of queen h6, which is more or less impossible to stop. And it can safely be said that white is completely winning here. Magnus tried bishop g5. And now many moves win. I mean, the cutest one was pointed out by the engine was bishop d4. With the idea after queen takes d4 to play g takes h3, opening up the g file for the rook. And basically just winning a piece. After something like queen e5 takes, and h4, followed by taking on g5. Kramnik chose the more human, simpler option, bishop f6, and this is also just completely winning. Yeah, I was suggesting bishop takes h2 as the last try, the point being check perpetual, but after bishop takes g2, white has the very simple and very strong queen g3. After queen takes g3, king takes, and black will simply lose a piece. Because if bishop takes f6, the knight takes, and I will just collect the rook, and the bishop is still hanging on g2. So bishop takes g2, didn't work, and Magnus played bishop g4, but then takes, queen h6, and it will be mate with bishop f6. He tried rook takes e4, but then queen takes h5. Queen f5, just queen h6, and white was a piece up and converted quite easily. So, what can we say about the game? Well, Kramnik, of course, played very, very well the first part. Bishop d3, probably prepared quite strong novelty. Rook e8, he played, and here already it's clear that black didn't quite manage to equalize, although d5 comes quite close. And Magnus really maybe wanted to get some counter chances and be able to complicate the position. Despite taking risks, he took on d4. This was probably too risky in hindsight. b5, and here, until here, Kramnik played very well. This part, I think that he didn't get the most out of his position. He went for this, and here, of course, queen c7 is a critical. Here, I think that black should already be okay. But queen c7 was very sharp. They both calculated everything here, until he simply missed that bishop takes f2 is necessary. After which it looks like it's drawn, so this queen takes, and here already white is again clearly on top, and he could have fought on with bishop takes h3, but the position is very bad. And after knight h4, it was just over. So a very good game by Kramnik, not a very good game by Magnus. Probably he has to figure out the right amount of risks that he can allow himself to take against such world-class opposition, and also maybe study the subtleties of the Italian defense a bit more. I think that was it about this game. I will say thank you very much for listening to me, my first game of the day, and hopefully there will be many more. And see you tomorrow.